Constitutionalism in India with reference to the Acts of 1909 and 1919. Constitution. The supreme law of the land, the basic law of a state which sets out how that state will be organized, the powers and authorities of the government between different political units, and by stating the basic principles of the society. In Black Law Dictionary, the fundamental and organic law of a nation or state that establishes the institution and system of government, defines the scope of governmental sovereign powers, and guarantees individual civil rights and civil liberties. Thomas Paine remarks that government without a constitution is a power without a right. Constitutionalism. Constitutionalism. The doctrine or system of government in which the governing power is limited by enforceable rules of law and concentration of power is limited by various checks and balances so that the basic rights of the individuals and groups are protected. A commitment to limitations on ordinary political power, it revolves around a political process, one that overlaps with democracy in seeking to balance state power and individual and collective rights. It draws on particular cultural and historical contexts from which it emanates, and it resides in public consciousness. Constitutionalism recognizes the need for government with powers but also at the same time insists that limitation be placed on those powers. It envisages checks and balances by restraining the powers of governmental organs by not making them controlled and arbitrary. The Indian Councils Act or the Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909. The Indian Councils Act 1909 was introduced by the British government in India as a step towards including Indians in government. It is also referred to as the Morley-Minto Reforms, named after the two British officials who played a key role in its drafting. Lord Minto and Lord John Morley were the then Viceroy and Secretary of State of British India, respectively, in 1905 to 1910. In the early 20th century, two developments emerged in the Indian national movement. First, nationalists became increasingly vocal and adopted a stronger tone while demanding representation of Indians in the government. Second, the period saw the emergence of extremist nationalists who aimed to undermine the foundations of the British rule. In some cases, government officials, both British and Indians, were killed. The British termed the prevailing political situation in the country as the Indian unrest. Lord Minto denounced the extremists but felt it was imperative to engage with the moderates and provide some political concessions, which came to be packaged as the Morley-Minto reforms. These reforms were the basis of the Indian Councils Act of 1909. The Act was a relatively short document. Legislative councils. The articles of the Act, among other things, did the following: increase the size of various provincial legislative councils, created executive councils in the provinces of Bombay, Madras, and West Bengal, and introduced the office of a vice president at both the center and the provinces. The Act itself was skeletal. It was operationalized by a set of rules and regulations that fleshed out details that included the extent of franchise, which was limited, qualifications for members of legislative councils, and strikingly, the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims. While Indian nationalists welcomed the act as it seemed to provide the opportunity for Indians to join the government, they were not happy with the rules and regulations that spelled out the details, especially the introduction of separate electorates on the basis of religion, which they viewed as divisive. Other aspects of the act that disappointed the Indian nationalists was limited franchise and unreasonable qualifications required to stand for elections. The nationalists, not completely satisfied, continued the battle for substantiative forms of self-government after the act was put in place. R. Copeland, in The Constitutional Problem of India 1944, argues that while the Act could be seen as introducing representative government, British state officials did not think so and underplayed this. They still considered legislative councils as darbars rather than parliaments and felt that Indians were not ready for self government. Lord Morley himself told the House of Lords if it could be said that this chapter of reforms led directly or necessarily to the establishment of a parliamentary system in India, I, for one, would have nothing at all to do with it. The main features of the Monty-Chelmsford reforms of the 19th Act advocated the need to emancipate the local governments and legislatures from central control and to advance by successive stages in the direction of conferring responsible government on the provinces, established the framework for devolution of powers and gave credence to the cry for self-governance. Elections to the legislatures were introduced the idea of council of ministers being responsible to the parliament and elucidated the principle of accountable governance by directing the government of India must be the wholly responsible body to the parliament, provided for partial transfer of power to the electorate through the system of diarchy, prepared the ground for Indian federalism as it identified the provinces as units of fiscal and general administration, made provision for classification of the central and provincial subjects, introduced bicameral central legislature, Central Legislative Assembly and Council of States, establishment of a Public Service Commission in India for the first time, the Monty-Chelmsford reforms and administrative devolution. MCR, along with brought new ideas and dimensions in Indian polity which were unknown hitherto, like parliamentary system in India, involvement in budget making and policy formulation, participation in central legislative assembly, diarchy, that is decentralized form of government, etc. MCR marked the end of the policy of benevolent despotism and thus began the genesis of the responsible government in India. Elections to the legislatures were introduced to the people and this created political consciousness among the masses. Under these reforms, the central and provincial subjects were separated and the concerned legislatures were given authority to make laws on their respective lists of subjects. The central and provincial budgets were separated and the provincial legislatures were authorized to enact their budgets. MCR tried to get Indians in direct contact with administration for the first time and a number of Indian women got the right to franchise for the first time. Notwithstanding a substantial measure of devolution of power to the provinces, the unitary and centralized character of administration was intact. The viceroy was given power to decide whether a particular subject falls under a central or a provincial category. The provincial legislature could not take up for the consideration of bills relating to number of subjects without the prior consent of the viceroy. The diarchy in the provincial sphere miserably failed. The governor was controlling the pursuit by virtue of reserved subjects which were under his control. It was impossible for the ministers who were handling transferred subjects to implement any progressive measure for want of funds. This defeated the very purpose of devolution. The devolution of power does not mean federal distribution. The provinces got powers delegated by the central government. Governor General powers were intact with no responsible government at the center. It served no purpose for the effective devolution. The key principles of responsible government, self-governance and federal structure grew out of these reforms. Most scholars look at the Act as the first attempt by the British to introduce administrative devolution in India, albeit with significant restrictions. But at that time, the announcement of British government to gradually introduce a responsible government in India shattered the Indian expectation of self-government or Swaraj as reward for its help in the World War. It led to unrest and agitation. Brief regarding the Minto-Morley reforms. Viceroy, Morley Secretary of State. This act increased the size of legislative councils by including elected non-official members. An element of election was introduced at the Central Legislative Council, but the official majority was maintained. The members of the Legislative Council were allowed to ask supplementary questions. The members were allowed to move the resolutions on budget or any matter of public interest except subjects like armed forces, foreign affairs, and Indian states. This act provided the association of Indians with Executive Council of the Viceroy and the Governor. The first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council was Satyendra Prasad Sinha. The 1909 Act introduced a system of command representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under the separate electorate, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. For the first time, the seats of separation were sown. The 1909 Act legalized communalism. Minto was regarded as the father of communal electorate. The Minto-Morley reforms did not aim at establishing a parliamentary system of the government. The final decision on all matters was retained in the hands of the irresponsible executive. In brief, regarding the Government of India Act 1919, cause it emerged from the Monty Declaration. It was aimed to introduce a new age of cooperation between the Indians and the British. Action, it was established in 1919. Diarchy had been established. More seats for minorities, that is the Muslims, untouchables, etc. Allowed 3% of the population to vote. British retained power for defense, foreign relations and taxation. Local councils dealt with healthcare, education, etc. The result, still no home rule for Indian people. Insufficient funding meant that most of the local councils could not operate. Tried to increase Indian influence, only 3% of the population could vote. Thank you.